Thank you for the opportunity to share my story with you today. I would like to start with a bit of a background. In December 2013, a 2-year-old boy in a village in Guinea fell ill with a mysterious illness and died 2 days later. After 3 months, he was declared to be the first case of Ebola, which eventually infected more than 28,600 and took lives of more than 11,300 people in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. The reason Ebola spread undetected across the three countries is because the borders are very porous, and the community in these border towns and villages are highly mobile with family connections on different sides of the border. When a disaster strikes, it is human instinct to prioritize saving lives, and many other critical things like consulting and involving locals ends up quite low on the totem pole. Helping people is what we do, but in doing so, we forget sometimes to involve the community. In a disaster, the community feels panic, experiences fears, and has questions about the situation that is unfolding rapidly or which they have very little control. While the community wants us to save lives, they also have other expectations of us. First, they want to be included and be a partner in the intervention. They want to know that we are listening to them and understanding their needs and are being respectful to their culture and belief systems. Also, they need to see and hear from people they know, such as politicians, religious leaders, community leaders, or elders. When the messenger is known or trusted, the likelihood of making connection by the community is higher. That unfortunately did not happen with Ebola. Imagine people like me and our organizations who either appear during crisis or are already present in the country but are not necessarily well connected in the community are actually strangers as far as the community is concerned. Yet, when a disaster strikes, we are suddenly everywhere and telling them what to do. The relationship, trust, and communication between the community and the responders was damaged early. The reasons are varied, and some of them, in retrospect, were very easy to avoid and could have potentially saved lives. For example, when Ebola infected a family member, they often hid the relative at home or in another village, which meant that the ill person became worse and died while infecting the caregivers and others around them. So, why hide? Well, having lived with COVID for a year now, we know that human behavior is not always logical. People have fears, and being fearful hinders rational thinking. Then there's the role of social media and misinformation, as well as leaders with an agenda who stop the community from doing what is in their best interest. Let's take an example from COVID 19. We know that physical distancing and mask wearing will slow down the spread of virus and save lives. Yet, there is strong resistance to it in many places. So, an outbreak is not just a health issue, it is a cultural, social, economic, and political issue. Unfortunately, this was overlooked for many months at the beginning of Ebola. During Ebola, as the scientific community focused on the science, they missed consulting with the communities and leaders on the best solutions and approaches. And with that, trust was gone and the communication channels broken. Let me demonstrate this with a few examples. Ebola is highly infectious with an average death rate of 50%. Yet, the community was resistant to the responders trying to save lives. When I say responders, I mean healthcare workers, development workers, and people like you and me. It's not that the community did not want lives saved. It's just that we were outsiders who did not speak the language, did not understand their culture, and possibly did not pay attention to the local expertise. Here's another example. The community knew they were placing themselves at risk by touching even a droplet of sweat, blood, or saliva from someone who was infected or had died from Ebola. However, in a culture that's rich with traditions of family and neighbors taking care of each other, how do you convince them to not take care of the sick? As the level of distrust in the system was low, the community avoided bringing their sick to the hospital until the patient was gravely ill and could not be saved. So, hospitals, in fact, were places where loved ones went to die. When this happens often enough, the suspicions in the system increases and the community easily fell prey to the conspiracy theories that foreigners had deliberately introduced the virus or that local people were being killed to harvest organs or blood. Whether that's true or not, the community is not concerned about that. I would like to speak about the traditional burial practices, as an estimated 70% of new infections stemmed from them. Traditionally, a body is washed and touched before burial. Patients who died from Ebola remained highly infectious due to the discharge of bodily fluids and hence should not have been touched. Therefore, they were buried as soon as they died and often in unmarked graves by the responders. While this sounds horrible, the reason for burying the dead in unmarked graves was because there had been instances when the family knew where the body was and would exhume it at night to complete the rituals during which they got infected. Let me add here that by the time I arrived, safe, dignified burial practices had received communities' buy in because responders had finally consulted the religious leaders, who then successfully engaged communities. However, the lingering effects of broken trust and communication were still around when I began engaging with the communities. At that point in time, WHO was moving away from awareness and knowledge about Ebola to community engagement and ownership, where community was at the center of every intervention. As the proverb goes in Sierra Leone, when chief vex, in no for make law, which, when translated, means when the chief is angry, it is not the time to make law. I was deeply aware that my team was not in a position to dictate or engage with the communities when they held grudges and did not trust us. We needed to include those who they trusted. My first priority, naturally, then was to understand the community, learn about their culture, and listen to them talk about factors that had led to the breakdown. Like any other disaster, Ebola was not just a health issue. Hence, it needed a multi pronged approach. People had lost livelihoods, school had been closed for months, pregnancy among teenage girls had risen, gender based violence had increased, and so on and so forth. We consulted widely with a variety of stakeholders like government, village chiefs, traditional healers, religious leaders, youth, community organizations, local anthropologists, and survivors of Ebola to understand the context. Our visits to communities in Freetown and other towns who had been at the epicenter of the outbreak helped us to identify the most appropriate approaches to social mobilization and gaining community ownership. While consulting so widely with the stakeholders did slow down the process, it was critical to our success. There is a Sierra Leonean proverb that captures this wisdom beautifully. Take tem kill anch, you go see ingot, which means take your time to kill the ant and you will then see its guts. Yes, building relationship, trust, and communication definitely is as hard as getting to an ant's guts. And it is even harder when one is rebuilding, as there has to be a sincere acknowledgement of resentment and hurt, as well as feelings and bitter memories that the community has. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of all these stakeholders. They helped us to integrate stories and local proverbs to communicate critical messages that resonated with the communities. They also helped us understand the fears and the best way to acknowledge and respond to them. We included the locals, the frontline workers who got trained were priests, imams, community leaders, youth, survivors of Ebola, members of local community organization, village chiefs, etc., who then spread out across the country to mobilize the community and help stop the spread of Ebola. These frontline workers were from the community and understood the nuances that people like me did not and could not. The survivors made some of the most compelling social mobilizers as they could confidently dispel myths. When they said Ebola is real, the community listened. In a disaster, people want to hear from those who are from amongst them and closest to them. I and hundreds of others were not from amongst them. Local grassroots organizations and stakeholders, I mentioned a few moments ago, are best positioned to operate in complex environments, to jump in immediately, to provide timely assessments, and to quickly disseminate information and critical services when a disaster strikes. They have the wisdom and the social capital that can be leveraged to assess the severity of the problem and get through to those who are opposed. From the first case of Ebola in Sierra Leone in May 2014 to the country being declared Ebola free in March 2016, almost 2 years later, more than 14,000 people had been infected and the disease had taken lives of close to 4,000 people across the country. Liberia and Guinea were declared Ebola free 3 months later. Those who died and those who survived taught us many lessons. Before we act, we, the responders, must observe, learn, ask enough questions, and listen more effectively. A community's understanding of diseases and their spread is complex, context dependent, and culturally mediated. A participatory approach goes a long way to build respect, trust, and communication. The community is the expert of their situation, and we must leverage their wisdom so we can respond in the most appropriate manner. Thank you.